I still remember the way the morning sunlight glimmered on the strange wooden planks. It was a bright Monday in early autumn when I stepped onto my back porch and nearly dropped my mug of coffee. There, stretching across my property from a narrow creek to the far edge of a newly developed neighborhood, was a brand-new footbridge, complete with a glossy finish, metal railings, and an official-looking no trespassing sign ironically posted right in the middle of my land. In all my 62 years, I'd never seen anything like it. To say it was baffling would be an understatement. I'd been living on this acreage for 3 decades, ever since my wife Marion, and I decided we wanted a quiet place to raise our daughter. Our property lines bordered a wooded stretch with an old creek, where tall cottonwoods provided shelter from the wind and a natural sense of privacy. Then, as the township grew, a wealthy developer put up a small gated community next door, a cluster of expensive houses and manicured lawns, complete with newly formed homeowners association. I'd heard them mention wanting better pedestrian access to their community park and that they were exploring solutions to expand their walkways. But I never imagined they'd put a footbridge right across the water onto my land without so much as asking permission. I set down my coffee mug and marched down the slope, grass crunching under my boots. As I got closer, I realized the footbridge was no slapdash construction. The boards were pressure-treated pine, carefully installed with professional craftsmanship. The railings were steel. The sign, now that I could read it up close, stated, HOA private property, crossing prohibited except for approved residents. The nerve of it all made my blood boil. So they built a pristine, expensive structure, presumably to let their fancy homeowners stroll from their backyards to the creek and beyond, onto my private property. And they even had the gall to slap a no trespassing sign for my benefit. Now, I'm not typically one to go picking fights. I spent most of my professional career in a steel mill, working overtime to make ends meet. I appreciate rules as much as the next person, especially if they help keep a neighborhood safe and well-maintained. But this was beyond the pale. It wasn't a matter of stepping 1 or 2 feet beyond property line. This was a full-fledged footbridge, the kind of structure that likely cost thousands of dollars. And it was on my land, not theirs. They had to know that. A project like that would have required all sorts of surveys, permits, and contractor visits. You don't just throw up a sturdy walkway over a creek overnight without planning. I squatted down, running a hand across the pine boards, half expecting them to be some cheap imitation. But they were solid, no expense spared. The metallic smell of fresh paint and varnish hung in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of damp leaves. On the other side of the bridge, I could see the backyard of one of those big, cookie-cutter houses. A tall privacy fence was partially obstructed by a brand-new wooden gate that likely led to the path continuing through the HOA's territory. I could see carefully planted rose bushes along the fence line and a small sign that read Hawthorne Estates, presumably the name of that fancy development. I was so startled and, let's be honest, outraged that it took me a few moments to collect my thoughts. My first impulse was to rip down that sign, but a second voice in my head said to hold off. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a dozen pictures of the entire structure. The footbridge, the sign, the location along the creek, the boundary markers. I wanted concrete evidence of what they had done, because something told me I was about to step into a complicated battle. Marion was just inside, making breakfast. I slipped into the kitchen, my boots tracking bits of dewy grass on the floor. She looked up from the skillet of scrambled eggs, gave me a concerned frown, and asked what had me so worked up. I explained everything, from a vantage on our porch to the sign posted on our land. She set down the spatula, her jaw dropping in disbelief. "This has to be illegal," she said, turning off the burner. "Even if they have a right-of-way, didn't you always say that the boundary to the creek was fully ours?" "It is," I replied firmly. "We have the county records, the original survey. The property line runs well along the creek, and I've never sold or granted them an easement. This can't be legal." We needed to gather the facts before storming over to the HOA's offices. Marion went to her laptop to pull up our old property survey file, while I grabbed a thick manila envelope with the official records from a hallway cabinet. My thoughts were racing. Why would a neighborhood association risk building on someone else's land without permission? Did they think they could strong-arm us? Or did some clerk in the county office provide them incorrect information? Marion and I pored over the documents, confirming that the property lines extended to the far side of the creek. There was no mention of any shared easement, no record of an agreement allowing a bridge. We double-checked for any weird local ordinances or prescriptive easements, but nothing applied here. We had full private ownership. Maybe we should just talk to them first, Marion suggested, carefully stacking the papers. We'll show them the documents, ask them to remove the bridge, and hopefully that'll be that. I nodded, though I was skeptical. HOAs had reputations for being pushy about their own regulations, but not always so eager to follow the law outside their borders. Still, maybe it was all a misunderstanding. I found a phone number for the Hawthorne Estates HOA, dialed, and braced myself for what was sure to be a revealing conversation. Little did I know, that phone call would only be the start of a tangled dispute that would eventually turn my life upside down, and, most unexpectedly of all, leave me with a windfall I never saw coming. When I called the number listed for Hawthorne Estates HOA, I got an automated message that directed me through a maze of menu options. Press 1 for covenants and restrictions, press 2 for landscaping and facilities, press 3 for billing, and so on. I finally reached a real human being after pressing what I hoped was the right extension. A bored-sounding man introduced himself as Greg, the HOA administrative assistant. He asked for my lot number, and I explained that I wasn't part of their association, that I was a neighboring landowner with a complaint about a structure they'd built. As soon as I mentioned the footbridge, he paused for a moment. "I think I know what you're talking about," he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "I'll transfer you to our facilities coordinator, Mr. Pilgrim." A click later, I found myself speaking to someone who introduced himself more formally. "Hello, this is Gary Pilgrim, facilities coordinator for Hawthorne Estates. How can I help you?" I laid it all out, trying my best to stay calm. "You folks put a footbridge on my property, an illegal structure. I've got the survey and all the documentation to prove it. I need an explanation." He cleared his throat. "Well, sir, this footbridge is intended to provide safe pedestrian crossing for our residents. We have reason to believe the creek is a shared boundary and that we have an easement for a walkway. It was part of the original development plan." I had expected something like that. "Your original plan," I replied, "must be incorrect. This creek is entirely on my side of property line. You're free to check county records. I can show you the paperwork. But you have no legal right to build anything on my land, let alone post a sign that says, 'No trespassing.'" He paused again, more quietly this time, then muttered something about looking into it. Before we ended the call, I requested an in-person meeting. He reluctantly agreed, suggesting we meet later that week in the HOA's private offices located near their clubhouse. I hung up feeling a swirl of emotions, anger, frustration, and curiosity. Marion and I both suspected that if this was no simple mistake, the HOA might have done this to strong-arm us. But why? Were they hoping we wouldn't notice or challenge them? When Thursday rolled around, I found myself driving through the Hawthorne Estate security gate, feeling distinctly out of place as I passed rows of newly built houses, each looking more elaborate than the last. Perfectly mowed lawns, symmetrical garden beds, and carefully placed decorative fountains dotted the neighborhood. It was all pleasant enough to the naked eye, but somehow gave off a sterile vibe, like everything here was choreographed for appearances. The clubhouse was a 2-story building with wide glass doors. I stepped inside, noticing the smell of fresh paint and the hush of air conditioning. In a small conference room, I met Mr. Pilgrim, an unassuming man in his late 40s with thin, neatly combed hair and dark-rimmed glasses. Alongside him sat a lawyer named Diane Baker. She wore a crisp suit, and her eyes flickered with professional curiosity as she shook my hand. They offered me a seat. The table between us had a stack of documents, likely their version of the property records, along with color-coded maps and site plans. Right away, Ms. Baker took charge of the conversation, talking in measured, careful phrases about public utility easements and shared boundary assumptions. With each statement, I found myself biting my tongue, so I wouldn't interrupt. Finally, After she explained that they believed the footbridge was built on communal territory, I pulled out my own survey documents. This is a formal county map, updated less than 5 years ago. The creek is well within the boundary lines of my property. There's no mention of a shared easement, and if you check the deed from when I purchased the land decades ago, you'll see 0 references to a public walkway or anything of the sort. I don't know how you got the notion that it was communal territory. Ms. Baker skimmed the pages, her expression darkening slightly as she saw the official stamps. "We'll need time to verify these," she said calmly. Mr. Pilgrim was quieter, his eyes darting between her and me as though trying to gauge who was in the right. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "when can I expect this bridge to be removed?" Ms. Baker adjusted her jacket collar. "We're not taking any hasty actions. We have to confirm the legal ownership. If it's truly on your land, we'll discuss next steps. But the association is not prepared to dismantle a community fixture until we're absolutely sure." I felt a flare of anger. "I'm pretty sure already," I replied. "I'd advise you to be sure sooner rather than later." The meeting wrapped up with the promise of a formal follow-up letter. As I left, I couldn't help notice how Mr. Pilgrim avoided my gaze. Ms. Baker's polite, steely handshake told me we were in for a fight. I was right. Over the next couple weeks, I received multiple calls from mediation services, supposedly trying to broker a compromise. One of them suggested maybe we could share the land, or the HOA could pay a small monthly fee for the footbridge's existence. I laughed at the idea. A small fee for the right to occupy my property without permission? The nerve was staggering. Meanwhile, my neighbors in the development, some of whom I'd known casually for years, suddenly stopped waving when they saw me. One older couple I used to chat with at the local diner looked away, avoiding any conversation. It felt like the HOA was spinning the story inside their gates, that I was a stubborn old crank trying to block a harmless community improvement. Maybe they believed it was only a matter of time before I gave in. But I wasn't giving in. Not this time. Something about this situation lit a fire in me. I wasn't about to roll over and let them boss me around. And if they thought they could quietly win just by ignoring me, well, they were about to discover my persistence. In the midst of this, Marion suggested we explore all our legal options. "Don't let them wear you down," she said one morning as we tidied up after breakfast. We fought bigger battles in life than some HOA nonsense. She was right. We'd raised a family, navigated job losses, survived personal tragedies. An HOA footbridge fiasco was annoying, but not insurmountable. I contacted a local real estate attorney, Mr. Johnson, who agreed to meet with me and review the documents. He nodded sagely as I laid out the situation. "You're in the right, from everything I see here. The key question is whether they'll back off when we notify them officially, or if we'll have to file a lawsuit to have them remove it." I grimaced at the word lawsuit, not wanting to get into a court battle. I still hoped they'd see reason. But the HOA's resistance so far had me worried. What I didn't know was that the tangled path ahead would soon lead me down a surprising road, one that ended not with me writing checks to lawyers for months on end, but with an unexpected profit that would change my entire perspective on the ordeal. The weeks that followed were a haze of back-and-forth letters, phone calls, and all sorts of posturing. My attorney, Mr. Johnson, sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, stating that they had no right to construct or maintain the bridge. The HOA's lawyer, Ms. Baker, responded by insisting that various matters needed further review, though she offered no specifics. It felt like they were stalling, perhaps hoping I'd get tired and let it slide. Meanwhile, I had to live with that footbridge sitting there, smack in the middle of my land. At first, I considered setting up a fence around it or even blocking off physically, but Mr. Johnson advised caution. "Let's not do anything hasty that might escalate the tension," he said. "A court might see it as you taking matters into your own hands. We should go through proper legal channels." So I followed his advice. But internally I was fuming. Each time I looked out my back window, that footbridge stood as a stark reminder that the HOA believed they could trample my rights. Every few days, I'd catch a glimpse of people crossing it. Some were residents from Hawthorne Estates, out for a jog or walking their dog. Once, A teenager rode a bike across it. They seemed oblivious to the fact they were trespassing. No one jumped a fence or crawled under it. They all waltzed across the creek and onto my property as if it was a public park. I warned a couple of them to leave. Some apologized in confusion, saying they thought it was an HOA-approved trail. Others simply shrugged like they had no idea who owned what. The best I could do was politely but firmly direct them off my property. Word gradually spread in the neighborhood that I wasn't amused by their uninvited visits. One chilly afternoon, I decided to channel my frustration into research. If they refused to remove the structure, maybe there was a way for me to benefit from this. You might call it a stroke of opportunism, but I started to wonder, what if I charged for access? After all, if the HOA wanted a convenient walkway over the creek so badly, maybe they'd be willing to pay a real fee, one that recognized the actual value of the land, not just some insulting pittance. So I scoured local regulations on right-of-way usage and discovered that in some cases, landowners who allow the public onto their property can negotiate agreements, even set up limited liability structures or usage fees. It's not always straightforward, but the law does allow for paid easements or usage rights. This gave me an idea. Instead of just demanding they tear down the bridge, maybe I could offer them an official lease or license to keep it there at a price, of course. I brought the idea to Mr. Johnson, expecting him to dismiss it. But to my surprise, he nodded thoughtfully. It might just work. If we can prove that the HOA is benefiting financially from this walkway, improving their property values, offering a nice amenity, then they should compensate you fairly for the use of your land. We can approach it as a business proposition. Either remove the bridge immediately or sign a contract and pay an annual fee. That was the nudge I needed. I asked him to draft a document proposing a lease agreement. We set the fee high enough to be worth my while, but not so astronomical that the HOA would laugh and walk away. The gist was that if they want to keep the footbridge, legally, they'd pay me a sizable annual rent plus carry the insurance liability. If they refused, then we'd proceed with a lawsuit demanding its removal and damages for trespassing. Within a week, I had the official proposal in my hands. Reading over it, I felt a strange satisfaction. While I still hated the idea that they'd built on my property without permission, the thought of turning their arrogance into a tidy profit was undeniably appealing. We sent the proposal over to Ms. Baker's office, along with a note explaining our intentions. For a couple of weeks, we heard nothing. Then, out of the blue, Mr. Pilgrim called me directly. His tone was a lot more polite than before, almost humble. "We received your lease proposal," he said. "It's, quite a bit more expensive than we expected." I didn't sugarcoat my response. "Well, Mr. Pilgrim, I didn't expect to have a footbridge built on my land without so much as a heads up. Surprises come with costs, wouldn't you say?" He hesitated, presumably weighing his words. "The board is considering its options. We might just remove the bridge. But that itself could be expensive to dismantle, and some of the residents are strongly in favor of keeping it. They say it's a great benefit to the community. We also have to think about potential legal costs if we fight this in court. The board will decide at our next meeting." A flicker of hope sparked in me. Maybe they'd finally come to their senses. "Let me know what the board decides," I said. "But be aware, if we go to court, I'll be seeking damages and attorney's fees, and I'll likely win. The cost could end up being even higher than my lease." He sighed, thanked me, and hung up. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. A week or two later, Ms. Baker sent a letter, carefully worded but basically acknowledging that they might be open to paying for the usage rights. She demanded a few changes, including limiting the term to a shorter period and clarifying maintenance responsibilities. Mr. Johnson and I countered with some tweaks of our own. It was a slow, methodical process, but every new draft got us closer to an agreement. While all this was happening, word must have spread around Hawthorne Estates that the footbridge fiasco was becoming a financial liability. A local real estate newsletter ran a small piece about the bridge controversy, hinting that property owners in the development might see higher HOA dues if the board agreed to pay me. A few folks in the neighborhood actually came to me individually, offering to help negotiate or work something out, presumably so they wouldn't end up paying more. But I politely told them all that I prefer to work through official channels. It felt like a game of chicken. The HOA could remove the bridge, saving themselves the lease fees but angering the residents who had grown fond of it, or they could pay up to keep it, passing along the cost to everyone. They had dug themselves into a lose-lose scenario by acting so rashly, and I wasn't shedding any tears over it. Still, I wasn't entirely sure how it would end. The board could decide to get rid of the bridge after all, leaving me with nothing but the satisfaction that I'd stood my ground. But as I stood on my porch one crisp autumn evening, watching the sunset behind the structure they'd so brazenly erected, I had a hunch that greed would win out on their side, too. The convenience and prestige of that walkway might just be enough to make them swallow their pride and write me a sizable check. I found myself almost laughing at the irony. I hadn't asked for any of this, but if they were determined to keep violating my property rights, I might at least make them pay handsomely for privilege. It was a chilly morning when the letter finally arrived, a formal offer from Hawthorne Estates HOA to enter into a lease agreement for footbridge. I tore open the envelope with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The official letterhead read, "Dear Mr. Reynolds, after careful consideration and review of the relevant documents, the Board of Hawthorne Estates Homeowners Association is prepared to offer the following terms." My eyes scanned the page, checking each detail. They agreed to pay an annual sum that was a bit lower than my initial proposal, but still impressively large, enough to make a meaningful difference in my retirement nest egg. They also accepted responsibility for insurance, liability, and maintenance. The best part? They'd pay any legal fees related to any claims arising from the use of that bridge. In other words, if anyone slipped and fell, it wouldn't come out of my pocket. As Marion hovered behind me, reading over my shoulder, we both exchanged a glance of astonishment. "They really caved," she said, her tone a mixture of relief and pride. "It looks that way," I replied, hardly believing in myself. I guess the thought of tearing down that expensive bridge and dealing with all the outraged residents was too much for them. In a separate paragraph, they added that they still believed there was some ambiguity in the property boundary, but were agreeing to these terms in the interest of community harmony and expediency. It was their polite way of saving face, claiming they had admitted fault, even though the agreement basically spelled out that the land was unquestionably mine. Mr. Johnson gave the offer a careful read, made a few minor suggestions, and then recommended we sign. "This is a strong agreement. It gives you everything you need, money, legal protection, and formal acknowledgement of your property rights," he said with a grin. "I'd say you won." A week later, I sat at a conference table in that same pristine clubhouse, shaking hands with subdued Mr. Pilgrim and an even more reserved Ms. Baker. Present were a few other board members who offered stiff, polite smiles. They looked less like victors and more like people who just swallowed a bitter pill. We signed the lease agreement, notarized it, and handed over the final paperwork. By the end of the hour, the footbridge, an object I'd once considered an unwanted intrusion, was officially a lucrative fixture that would line my pockets annually. I won't pretend it didn't feel surreal. The very next day, I strolled down to the creek with Marion by my side, and we stood looking at the structure. Once, it had angered me every time I saw it. Now I just felt an odd kind of amusement. "We should christen it," Marion joked. "Sprinkle a little champagne on it, and officially rename it Reynolds Bridge." "Or Profit Bridge," I said with a chuckle, because that's exactly what it turned into. From that point on, I found myself in a strange new role. I was, in a sense, the HOA's landlord. Whenever they needed to do maintenance or repaint the structure, they had to inform me in writing. I could walk up and inspect it whenever I wanted. If any part of the lease terms was violated, say they tried to expand beyond the specified footprint, I could terminate the agreement and force them to remove it at their own expense. Oddly enough, a few of the more neighborly residents started warming up to me again once word spread that the situation was resolved. Some approached me in the local grocery store or the post office, offering sheepish apologies. "We didn't realize you owned all that land," one man said, shaking my hand a bit too vigorously. "Glad the HOA worked something out that's fair." Others asked if I planned to sell the land now that it was so valuable. I wasn't sure yet. Part of me liked the idea of living out my days on this old property, letting the annual lease payments supplement my retirement. Another part wondered if I might eventually sell to someone else, let them collect the bridge money while Marion and I moved closer to our daughter or spent our golden years traveling. The options, at least, were wide open, and that was a wonderful feeling. In the months that followed, the irony of the whole situation never ceased to amuse me. At first, I had just wanted that bridge gone, but had the HOA promptly removed it, I'd have ended up with nothing but a sense of vindication. Instead, they dug in and forced the confrontation to escalate, which ultimately led them to sign an agreement that benefited me beyond anything I'd originally imagined. In the end, their own stubbornness became the reason they surrendered so much leverage. Over time, I noticed a subtle change in how the HOA board acted toward me. They started inviting me to certain community events, presumably to show we were on good terms. I politely declined most of those invitations, not really feeling the need to mingle with the folks who tried to steamroll me, but I kept my relationship cordial. After all, they were now paying me a tidy sum each year, and if letting them host their fancy barbecues and holiday gatherings across that footbridge kept them happy, and my checks coming in, then so be it. Occasionally, new homeowners in Hawthorne Estates reached out to me, asking about the land lease arrangement and whether they could do something similar on another part of my property, like building a community garden or dog park. I always gave them a polite but firm no. One intrusion is more than enough. I'd say, I'm not running a public park here. The only reason that bridge is still there is because your HOA decided they'd rather pay than tear it down. Some understood. Others shook their heads at the cost. But that was their board's decision, not mine. Life settled back into a comfortable routine. Marion and I traveled a bit. Even took a cruise to Alaska, something we dreamed of for years. We had more financial freedom, thanks to those lease checks arriving right on schedule. And every time I returned home, I'd see that once despised footbridge and realize just how much life can take an unexpected turn. Sometimes I'd stand there in the early morning light, sipping my coffee, reflecting on the entire ordeal. I'd think back to that first moment when I nearly dropped my mug in shock at the sight of that brand new structure. Who would have guessed that it would become such a bizarre windfall? Perhaps the biggest lesson was that you never know when someone else's overreach might open up an opportunity, if you're willing to stand your ground and negotiate from a position of strength. People love telling stories about the HOA from hell, but in my case, their heavy-handed approach ended up building me a private revenue stream, literally bridging the gap between my modest retirement funds and a future full of possibilities. In the end, their plan backfired in a way I'm sure they never saw coming. And you'd better believe, every time I cash that annual check, I can't help but grin from ear to ear. The end.